Cleopatra was born in 69 BC in the city of Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, situated in the Nile Delta. Cleopatra was an important queen of ancient Egypt, and her name continues to this day. She is one of the best-known women in the history of mankind. Throughout her life, she stood as a strategist, determined, very intelligent, cunning, and owner of a gigantic fortune. Once, the Greek philosopher Plutarch wrote the following about her: "The contact with her presence, if we lived with her, was irresistible." The Egyptian ruler fascinated many people in her time. To this day, she continues to enchant many. Her life trajectory is widely studied, researched, and debated. In order to understand her greatness, there are some interesting facts. In a temple dedicated to the goddess Venus, at the request of the Roman leader Julius Caesar, who was Cleopatra's lover, a golden statue of the Egyptian queen was built. There are records that this monument was seen and venerated at the site until at least the 2nd century AD. Curiously, Cleopatra was even venerated as a true goddess, more precisely as a new goddess Isis, one of the most important deities of ancient Egypt. She was also identified as Aphrodite, Greek goddess, whose attributes are similar to those of Isis. Cleopatra also had refined intelligence. She received a remarkable education. Together with the other children of royalty, she was educated in the palace where she lived. Cleopatra was able to speak 7 or 8 languages, which greatly facilitated her agreements and political stratagems. She was reportedly the first person in her family to speak the Egyptian language without interpreters. In addition, she succeeded in studying philosophy and rhetoric. From an early age, she learned oratory, which she knew how to use in a very intelligent way, speaking with the correct posture, appropriate gestures, and a soft voice. With regard to her vast knowledge, it should be remembered that Cleopatra lived in Alexandria, a cultural center in antiquity, with the famous Library of Alexandria, full of many literary works in an unprecedented structure. These local circumstances were very important and influential in the cultural formation of the Egyptian ruler. Her achievements made her the lover of 2 of the most famous Roman generals of her time, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. As is often the case with historical figures, much information about the life of this remarkable woman has been distorted over time. Today, we can find the image of Cleopatra stamped on the most varied objects, and her name is known by many people, although not by everyone what she was like in reality. In fact, these physical representations of the figure of the queen usually consist of one of the many distorted points in her story. Regarding the queen's look, Plutarch wrote the following words: "She wasn't so unique that there were no comparison, or that we couldn't look at her without being touched." We can also get an idea of how she was physically through various coins that were created and circulated at the time when Cleopatra lived. These objects are the most reliable sources for us to imagine what she looked like. There are also some busts sculpted over time that apparently represent the queen. When we see the coins, we notice the protrusion of the nose and chin. In fact, the philosopher Pascal wrote, "If Cleopatra's nose had been smaller, the whole face of the world would have been different." Taking into account this comic phrase and noticing the features that the powerful Egyptian woman has in the coins, we can conclude that perhaps she was not as extraordinarily beautiful as the cinema showed us. But one thing is certain: her conquests and way of being surpass any Hollywood representation. Let's see now why. Cleopatra belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was in power for 3 long centuries. Their rule was marked by many marriages and murders among the family members. This imposing dynasty was born after the death of the mighty Alexander the Great, king of Macedonia. With his death, his empire was divided among his generals. An ancestor of Cleopatra, Ptolemy I Soter, was among them, who initiated the Ptolemaic dynasty after starting to rule the magnificent city of Alexandria, an unparalleled cultural center of ancient Egypt. In view of this genealogical tree, it is important to remember that the powerful Cleopatra referred to in this video is Cleopatra VII. 6 other Cleopatra preceded her in her family lineage. In Alexandria, the queen lived in a luxurious palace, full of wealthiness and beautiful ornaments. The palace was huge and spacious, with more than 100 rooms and a stunning external landscape. There were breathtaking gardens, decorated with beautiful statues and fountains. This fantastic palace was constantly enlarged, with successive generations of Ptolemaic figures. The site became the most luxurious palace in the Mediterranean. Cleopatra, daughter of Ptolemy XII, grew up in this reality. She had 2 sisters, Berenice IV and Arsinoe IV, and 2 brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. When her mother died, Berenice IV settled in power, but her period as ruler was short, and the young woman was killed by her own father. It is important to underline again that the lineage of the Ptolemies had as one of its main characteristics the murders. Later, Arsinoe IV was exiled by Julius Caesar and later executed by Mark Antony at the behest of his own sister Cleopatra. The fate of Ptolemy XIV was no different. Cleopatra began to rule Egypt at the age of 17, after the death of her father. According to tradition, she married his brother Ptolemy XIII, who, at the time, was only 13 years old. Sometime after Cleopatra became the queen of Egypt, her brother and husband, Ptolemy XIII, began to take an interest in ruling the country without the intervention of his sister. Pothinus, Achillas, and Theodotus of Chios, 3 important advisors to the young king, agreed with this idea to persuade the young man to break with Cleopatra and remove her from power. The queen, during her government, wanted to maintain political ties with Italy in a showcase of her strategic skills. Her goal was to strengthen friendship with the Romans, who could be important allies in the event of a civil war in Egypt. Her main ally would be General Pompey, leader of one of the most traditional Roman families. These diplomatic maneuvers led to Cleopatra being accused of treason for deceiving her brother. At the age of 21, the young ruler was forced to leave Alexandria and went into exile in Syria, where she assembled an army. The young Egyptian king and his 3 advisors decided to go in search of the queen to prevent her return to Alexandria at all costs. However, during their search, they learned of the unexpected news. Pompey, who rivaled the great Julius Caesar, was on his way to Egyptian lands. He thought he would be welcomed by the Pharaoh himself, since he had been a great friend of his father. Pompey the Great was a very skilled general. Throughout his life, he conquered countless nations in Africa, Asia, and Europe. After suffering a defeat in Greece, the fearful Pompey fled to Egypt in search of refuge after a disastrous defeat in Greece against his enemy Julius Caesar. A conflict divided the Roman Empire between Pompey and Julius Caesar. This conflict became known as Caesar's Civil War. Upon learning that Pompey intended to disembark in the country, the Egyptian partisans reflected. Helping the old acquaintance Pompey was a risk, because it could be interpreted as a declaration of war on Julius Caesar, who commanded a very powerful war machine. Moreover, Ptolemy and his allies believed that Pompey could go help Cleopatra regain her place in royalty, and trouble had to be avoided. But Pompey had been a great friend of the father of the couple who ruled Egypt. Therefore, if they did not help him, he could break ties with the country, making Egypt an enemy of Rome. Theodotus and the 2 other counselors, Achillas and Pothinus, reflected on the matter. It was a difficult decision, and the consequences could be risky. But eventually, as the 3 counselors struggled to find a solution, Theodotus, with a smile, looked at his companions and said, "The dead do not bite." The choice had been made to break up with Pompey and establish an alliance with Julius Caesar. As Pompey approached Alexandria, he felt he would be welcomed by the Egyptians, but there was already a trap set up against the Roman, pretending that they would welcome him amicably. but as soon as Pompey arrived on Egyptian soil, he was brutally beheaded. A few days later, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria to seek out his adversary. The Egyptians showed him Pompey's head, and Caesar was shocked by the violence. Despite being his enemy, Caesar respected Pompey. On Caesar's orders, Ptolemy's advisor was executed. Caesar, with his army, went to the royal palace, where he settled and informed himself that he would like to see the king and the queen. It is important to remember that Ptolemy XVIII was prepared to face his sister's army. When he was informed of Julius Caesar's arrival, he headed for his palace. And Cleopatra? How could she return if she had abandoned Alexandria and if her brother and faithful guardians wanted her away from the city? She was in danger and she knew that she could not be seen. Then the queen had a rather unusual idea. In order to meet Julius Caesar, she created a plan and, to put it into practice, had the help of a Sicilian supplier named Apollodorus. They entered a boat where the queen was hidden, sailing the Nile River for 8 days. When they approached Alexandria, Cleopatra, still with the help of Apollodorus, entered a papyrus-made sack. The queen's accomplice tied the big sack with a leather rope and carefully entered the palace, leaving the sack in Julius Caesar's room. We don't know exactly what the Roman's reaction was when he found Cleopatra, but the Egyptian woman conquered him immediately. With Caesar by his side, everything would be easier. The opportunity to get rid of his brother and rule according to his interests was finally within her reach. With Pompey's assassination, Julius Caesar had a very negative opinion of Ptolemy. Cleopatra used the death of his former ally to her advantage. The queen convinced Caesar that she was the right person for the throne of Egypt. The Queen of Egypt and Julius Caesar entered a loving relationship. Caesar's decision to support Cleopatra angered Ptolemy, who declared war on Julius Caesar. The Roman general was at a numerical disadvantage and took a defensive position. This event became known as the Siege of Alexandria. Caesar and his men fought hard to defend their position, waiting for reinforcements. When his allies arrived, Caesar defeated Ptolemy's army at the Battle of the Nile. The young pharaoh drowned in the river. With Julius Caesar, the queen had a son named Ptolemy Caesar, historically and popularly known as Caesarion. Caesar's support was crucial to the consolidation of Cleopatra's power in Egypt. The Roman general returned to Rome, and Cleopatra reigned over Egypt. Everything seemed to go according to plan, but a huge turnaround would eventually happen. Cleopatra had consolidated her power on the throne of Egypt, and under her administration, Egypt prospered and the city of Alexandria experienced a cultural boom financed by the queen. Cleopatra organized an expedition to Rome. In the city, she stayed at Julius Caesar's mansion. The Egyptian queen took her son Caesarion in the voyage, the fruit of her union with the Roman general. Julius Caesar was at the height of his power and, as the leader of his nation, made several political and social reforms. He also organized a triumph in his own honor. The Parade of Caesar had the presence of Arisane, Cleopatra's sister, displayed as a prisoner, symbol of Rome's victory over the Egyptians. Caesar introduced the city to the Egyptian queen, but at the time, Rome did not yet have the glory that brought it into history. It was not yet comparable to Alexandria, the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt. Caesar's relationship with the foreigner was frowned upon by the Roman elite. There were a lot of rumors and lies about the couple. Caesar was named dictator in perpetuity and had an unrivaled power. The Roman senators were left without much of their influence and feared losing their remaining power. So they conspired against Caesar's life. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar was murdered by Roman politicians in a Senate session. Chaos engulfed Rome. General Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, pursued the conspirators. In a public square, he read Caesar's will. where his son with Cleopatra was not among the heirs. In his will, Caesar indicated his nephew Octavius as his successor. Rome was no longer a safe place for the Egyptian queen, and she returned to her kingdom. Meanwhile, Octavius and Mark Antony led their armies in the persecution of the men who betrayed Caesar. There was a remarkable encounter between Cleopatra and Mark Antony. In the year 41, he sent a messenger to Alexandria. Through this man, he called the queen for a meeting in Tarsus, a city located in present-day Turkey. The Egyptian queen arrived at the agreed place in a dazzling boat. The ship had a stern made of gold, its oars were made of silver, and the sails were purple. The navigation was accompanied by music. Fife, lyre, and flute were played. The queen, beautiful and ornated, was freshened up by her servants, and the boat had a wonderful smell. The entire population left their duties to follow Cleopatra's triumphal arrival. Mark Antony fell in love with her immediately. Still, in 41 BC, Cleopatra invited the mighty Mark Antony to visit Alexandria. However, after spending some time in the Egyptian city and getting involved with the queen, the Roman left and the two continued to exchange correspondence. The couple only met again after a long time, but before that reunion, something happened. In 40 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, recognized by Mark Antony himself as their heirs. The children were called Helios, a Greek origin, which means sun, and Selene, which means moon. During the absence of the Roman, where he was separated from the Egyptian queen, he even resumed his relationship with his wife Fulvia in Rome, although he could not forget Cleopatra. Fulvia eventually died, which may have made things easier and made it possible for Mark Antony to finally join Cleopatra once again. But Octavius, Julius Caesar's nephew, did not want that to happen. He suggested that his sister, Octavia, should marry the Roman general. That happened, and they had 3 kids in 2 years. Mark Antony, after Caesar's death, became consul general. Later, his power was divided between him, Octavius, and Lepidus, a political association known as the Second Triumvirate. Lepidus distanced himself from political life, which led to a dispute between Octavius and Mark Antony. The power in Rome was divided between the two. Caesar's nephew ruled the west, while Mark Antony managed the eastern provinces. Although he was married, and even against Octavius's will, the romance between Mark Antony and Cleopatra was not over. They met again in the city of Antioch, where they made their union official. The romance between the two was thriving, and they both seemed in love in Alexandria. The couple had many parties and banquets where they displayed their sovereignty. However, the Roman was forced to leave Egypt after an attack by the Parthians in Syria and Asia Minor, the inhabitants of the Parthian Empire in ancient Persia. Octavius reproved this union and was frustrated by the relationship between the Roman and the mighty Egyptian. In part, this was due to his sister Octavia, who ended up rejected by Mark Antony, and also for fear of losing part of the Roman Empire to the couple. A new civil war broke out in Rome between the supporters of Mark Antony and the defenders of Octavius. The Battle of Actium happened in 31 BC in a region in Greece, where both faced each other. Cleopatra accompanied her husband as he headed towards the long battle. But when the defeat of Mark Antony was already visible, she returned to Egypt, quietly announcing a false triumph. Octavius achieved a decisive victory in the naval Battle of Actium, and this victory marked the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the imperial period. However, his opponents eventually discovered the truth, while Cleopatra tried to maintain her position and conquer allies. She did everything she could so that together with Mark Antony, they could rise again. But he, after defeat, was no longer the same person. Octavius said he would forgive Cleopatra if she killed her lover. Ignoring the proposal, the Egyptian queen continued to try to motivate her husband while she tried to discover, together with her personal physician, a painless poison. The queen was preparing for the worst. The end of Mark Antony was tragic. While Cleopatra tried to flee from Octavius and his army, who had already arrived in Alexandria, the Roman soldier received the news that his lover had died. Desperate, he took his sword and wounded his own chest. However, the strike was not accurate and Mark Antony did not die immediately. While he was bleeding and suffering from the pain caused by the blow, he was informed that Cleopatra was still alive and managed to find the Egyptian monarch. His last breath happened in the arms of his lover. When he reached his other half, Mark Antony had already lost a lot of blood, and there was nothing that could save his life. Before dying, however, in the arms of his beloved Cleopatra, he asked her to collaborate with his opponent Octavius in order to save herself. After this request, the great Roman Mark Antony died. Caesarion, Caesar's heir sometime later, was also killed by Octavian. At that time, at funerals, it was common for women to hurt themselves with punches and scratches, accompanied by cries of pain and despair. That's what Cleopatra did in front of his late lover. Her injuries caused an infection, and she received treatment on the orders of Octavius. However, the queen, shaken by the death of her beloved Mark Antony and afraid of the future, tried to resist the treatment so that she could die. But Octavius terrorized her with threats to her children. Cleopatra gave in and, out of love for the heirs, accepted the proper treatment until she recovered her health. Cleopatra also had an impactful end. It was one of the events that eternalized her in history. The queen failed to escape her rival Octavius, who had arrested her in Alexandria, but she resisted and would not surrender to the enemy, going through the humiliation of being a prisoner and hostage of Rome. That would be too embarrassing for a woman like her. As for her sons, Caesarion was murdered, as was said, and the others were taken to Rome to be raised by Octavia. Cleopatra was constantly watched over by order of Octavius, since she had attempted suicide twice, after the death of Mark Antony. But Octavius's plans didn't go as expected. The queen, always cunning, put an end to her own life. Before that, she sent a letter to Octavius in which she asked to be buried next to her late husband. In relation to her death, some sources say that she was voluntarily bitten by a serpent and died from the poison. Other sources and scholars affirm that Cleopatra took some poison. With these uncertainties, her end is quite controversial. Some sources say Cleopatra's personal physician had a great deal of knowledge about poisons. Besides, the queen was always a strategist and effective person. Most likely, she prepared her death in advance. Finally, even though the most famous version is the one that states that Cleopatra died while being deliberately bitten by a serpent, it's more likely she ingested some lethal poison, which did not cause major discomfort at the time of her death. She was found on top of a couch, dressed in beautiful garments. People claim that she had a serene expression. She died 9 days after the death of her lover. Her funeral was solemn and elegant, worthy of an Egyptian queen. Her request to be buried next to Mark Antony was respected. After the death of the powerful monarch, Egypt became a Roman province. It was the end of the hegemony of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. Cleopatra's story is fascinating. Many of her female ancestors were important Egyptian rulers along with their husbands. Curiously, Egyptian women at that time had more freedom than women from other civilizations. Cleopatra did not play a secondary role in this lineage of women rulers and was a renowned figure. Her life journey was particularly hectic and impressive in many ways. Firstly, the Ptolemaic lineage, which is impressive due to the number of murders among the family members themselves. This habit, indeed, was inherited by Cleopatra. But regardless of these murders, the Ptolemaic government was very important to Egypt. and Cleopatra had major responsibilities and had to make important decisions throughout her life as ruler of Egypt. She had admirers and rivals. She was skillful, proactive, and extremely influential. She was a rare, special, quite determined woman. She always had strategies to achieve all her goals. Cleopatra marveled everyone because of her great knowledge and also because of her differentiated intelligence. The profile of the Egyptian queen, with all these qualities, allow her to conquer two of the most legendary characters in our history, the powerful Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. And, as time went by, Cleopatra's figure was often misrepresented, and the Egyptian woman was seen with prejudice. At times, it seems that her entire life path and conquest boiled down to having seduced these two Romans. But this view of the queen's life is simplistic, since she has had great political achievements. In any case, the legendary Egyptian queen has become a source of inspiration for some of the greatest artists in history. Among them, the painter Michelangelo, William Shakespeare. In their hands, the ruler became an illustrious piece of art. As we learn more about her story, we realize it's not by chance that Cleopatra has fascinated so many people in her time, and continues to captivate so many others in this day and age.